Salawat. We'll start the program with the recitation of Qur'an by Bilal. Can we welcome him with a loud salawat?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لم يكن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين منفكين حتى تأتيهم البينة رسول من الله يتلو صحفا مطهرة فيها كتب كريمة رسول من الله يتلو صحفا مطهرة فيها كتب كريمة ولا تفرق الذين أوتوا الكتاب إلا من بعد ما جاءتهم البينة وما أمروا إلا ليعبدوا الله مخلصين له الدين حنفاء ويقيموا الصلاة ويؤتوا الزكاة ذلك لمن ذي الكريمة إن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين منفكين في نار جهنم خالدين فيها أولئك هم شر البرية إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات أولئك هم خير البرية جزاهم عند ربهم جنات عدن تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عن ذلك لمن خشي ربه.
Thank you for that beautiful recitation. We'd now like to move on to the talk with Sheikh Zoheir Esmail. Can we welcome him with a loud salawat?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين صلاة على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد. We begin by thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all the sadness and sentiments in our hearts that He provided us with as it pertained to the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam on this day. And it is a great tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to feel connected in any way at all to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, especially considering how far away we are in time from the events that occurred. So we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all that He's provided us on this day. And inshallah, we continue with our topic of now looking at how we can look at Ashura as a case study for some of the discussions that we've been having when it comes to formulating a Sadrian psychological framework. So the first thing, if I remind you, we were talking about knowing and forgetting the soul. Those who know themselves know their Lord. Those who forget their Lord forget themselves. This is something we see very clearly on the day of Ashura, but also in terms of the events and the general conscious, the Muslim conscious at that time. And something for us to reflect on in these times as well. If we look at the state of the Muslim society at that time, we see that it is a society that is sleeping, despite all of the attacks on the very conscious of what it means to be a Muslim. The Muslim society is apathetic, or maybe even worse, are colluding with that type of movement. Imam Hussein alayhi salam explains this in one of his addresses, an address that he made in Dhul Husum. In Tariq al-Tabari, this is the address. He praised God and glorified Him, and then said, "Matters have reached a stage that you can see. The world has changed and become a facade. Its goodness has receded and continues to do so. No more than a trace remains. It is like residue at the bottom of a vessel or a trivial pasture with sparse grass." This is the examples that he's giving of how scarce truth is. Everywhere there's falsehood. "Do you not see that truth is not practiced and falsehood is not prevented?" So we have this situation here where while the truth is known, it is not acted upon. The apathy. And at the same time, falsehood, which is, we know what is false, that is not prevented by people. People's conscience is not at the stage where they are willing to step forward and make a stand and prevent those things that are not right. So you can see here very clearly in the Imam's explanation of the state of that society, that this is a society that has begun to forget its conscience, forget itself, forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in its very fabric. And of course, many times we link the forgetfulness of a society as a whole to the forgetfulness of the individuals as well. Yes, it's a two-way process. Sometimes society makes you forget, but at the same time, you are then a forgetful person within society as well. So the first lesson that we can draw from this discussion and understanding truly the place of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in formulating our own understanding of where we sit in the universe, we see very clearly in the circumstances surrounding the events of Ashura that the whole of the Muslim community was like that. And of course, the day of Ashura itself is an even bigger manifestation of that. The very conscious of the people who were on the camp of Imam al-Hussein showed that strength of awareness of who they are and who Allah is and where their position is in the universe. And at the same time, conversely, the enemies were the exact opposite. So that's one point that we'd like to draw out. The next point there is that the progression of the soul through enabling the theoretical and practical intellect to develop what was being eroded through the leadership of those who were not qualified to put such concerns at the forefront of the organization of their society. So here, this is in terms of those people who did not bend to the society, who did not become influenced by the currents and the kind of desires of the leaders who tried to dim that conscience as much as possible in order to have their own ends. Rather, there were people in those times who, through the progress of their soul, through purifying their practical and theoretical intellect, like we spoke about in the last lecture, they were able to maintain and to progress even in those circumstances. So while circumstances affect us, we are also able to transcend those circumstances, to go above those circumstances, if we work on ourselves and concentrate on ourselves. The next thing is that for many of the people there, their final end was something that was elusive to them. When I say it was elusive to them, it was elusive because they were unaware of it. It was elusive because they didn't think about it. They preferred to create a paradigm in which it is only their desires and hopes that guide them to understand where they're going. And because of that, material gain was at the heart of the actions of many people within the Muslim society. And of course, it was that material gain that was capitalized on by the Umayyads specifically. They were able to capitalize on the material hopes of people in order to dim that conscience again. So it's very important to know the soul and to know the progression of the soul, and to know, like we said at the end of the last lecture, that there are two clear paths, two paths that are completely opposed to each other. There is the path of felicitation, and there is the path of perdition. And each person needs to know which path they're traversing on. And if they don't know which path they're traversing on, then it's easy to be swayed here and there by what people say, by what the society says, and then be pushed to a way that perhaps is not the way of success. So this is the next one. The final one here that I have on the slide pertaining to knowing and forgetting the soul is that the enemies of the Imam's camp displayed complete ignorance of the soul. They were completely ignorant of the fact that they had to do something to improve their personalities. They completely ignored the people they were becoming in what they were doing. That material gain for them, or that popularity for them, was something that was so important that they had no idea of their soul. They had no idea of who they were becoming. And because they had the complete ignorance of the soul, they had a full range of psychological issues. Egotism, cruelty, these are all psychological issues. While on the other hand, the helpers of Imam Hussein, who were aware of their souls, aware of their progression of the soul, aware that they needed to do something in order to get to where they wanted to go to, they displayed all of the beautiful characteristics, things like spiritual intellection, resilience, calm, positivity even. There's a narration about Habib ibn Mudahir on the morning of Ashura, and he was in a jovial mood and even made a joke. And there was another companion that said, this is not a time for joking. But Habib explains that because he is aware of what the end is, and because he is the type of person that likes to lower the tension almost, he made the joke so that that tension could be lowered. So even the positivity to this extent was such that could be seen in some of the companions on the day of Ashura. Okay, the next point that I want to touch on is the connection between gradation and holistic therapy. We spoke about how the body and the soul are linked together. The body affects the soul, and conversely, the soul affects the body. And as such, this brings us to the idea that we don't need to just treat one. We don't need to just treat the body or the effects, chemical effects in the body, or we don't need to necessarily just treat the soul. We can find something that is holistic that will be able to affect both the body and the soul. So I've put here a relationship of interdependence between the body and all levels of the soul calls for holistic treatments which can be applied to the body or to the soul, or of course to both. And linking that to what we said about the practice of religion, religion does that. Religion gives regular treatment to the soul through holistic treatments. They are treatments that are to do with your body. You have to act in certain ways. But they also have a view, and the main view, towards the soul, towards the progression of the soul. So the remedies that we find within our religion itself is something that is already holistically inclined. The next point is that interventions can take place in thought process in order to address the theoretical intellect. As we talked about in terms of the theoretical intellect is something that we can deal with treatment, with talking, with therapy. This is how we usually look at it. When we look at Mulla Sadra's way of understanding the intellect as being both theoretical and practical, we can see here how we can reform the theoretical intellect through correct concepts, through moving through correct ideas, and so on and so forth. Or training for the practical intellect through the construction of good habits and affirmations. Something like Salaat is a good habit. Affirmations, we see them many times in the Holy Qur'an. The Holy Qur'an tells us about certain affirmations. Things like, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That is an affirmation that is supposed to be said in a time of difficulty. right? Something that is physically uttered in order to bring about a spiritual effect where it does bring a sense of calm for us to realize that to only Allah do we belong and to Him we shall return. But there are others as well. Lakum dinakum waliya din. This is setting barriers and boundaries. There is a time to stop arguing. There is a time to say, you have your way and I will have my way. Things also like Rabbi zidni ilma. Lord, increase me in knowledge. Again, for humbleness and putting us in the state of realizing that there's always one step beyond the state of knowledge that we have at the moment. These are all things that we can use in order to train our theoretical and practical intellects to move about in the right way. The last point there is that there is a scientific aspect of therapy as it relates to the body. This point that we draw from Mulla Sadra is significant because until now many of the scholars of Islamic psychology see science as a colonialist project and something that doesn't go with Islamic psychology. So this is a very important point for the contribution of Mulla Sadra in the way that he looks at the body and the soul and sees the body as part of the solution. And therefore science to do with the body is something that should be taken on and embraced to look for better solutions. The next point is about how Mulla Sadra looked at the soul. If you remember, there were two key aspects of the way the soul is. The first, that it is corporeal when it comes about. When it's born, it's corporeal. It's born with the body, not something that is, abstract from the body and then connects to the body. No, it is born with the body. But it progresses along with the body and takes its own journey and shapes itself until it transcends the body. And then it becomes abstract in its continuation or in its survival. And of course, like we said before, there are two broad tracks that it can take. It can either become spiritual or it can become demonic. And of course, very easy to see this in the events of Karbala. How people's souls moved more towards the spiritual when they were on the right camp and more towards the demonic when their mercy as the day went on became less and less and their acts became more and more violent as they went through the day. So again here, this is something that is very easy for us to see in the events of Karbala. The very acts of the practical intellect are shaped by the theoretical intellect, and therefore they have a direct impact on the trajectory of the soul and how it's shaped. The intellect here for Mulla Sadra is the main thing. How we have a practical and theoretical intellect and how we use that then to shape our souls. Martyrdom and murder both have great impacts on the soul and its actualization. So again, when we look at the events of Karbala, we see the effect of martyrdom and what it did for those people who were included amongst the martyrs. They became timeless, they became an example, but also in terms of their reward, how it is expressed. Many times when we look at hadith about reward, we think of it in material terms. It is not necessarily only in material terms. It is expressing to you a development. The development that they had through going through martyrdom is something that was very, very great indeed. And conversely as well, those people who participated in the murder of Imam al-Hussein, his companions and his family, the opposite is the case for them. They really, really damaged themselves. They really put themselves in a position such that when you look at their next life is terrible. That expression of the next life being in such a state is also the expression of their souls in this world. What they did to their own selves was such that there was no way for them even to recover from this kind of act. Coming back now to the developmental stages of the soul. As we spoke about before, the soul went through a number of stages of development. It went through the animal soul, it went through the plant soul, The plant soul is the soul that we use for all of our things that are similar to plants, things like growth, reproduction, and things like that. We'll go from the vegetative soul to the animal soul. The animal soul is then the soul in which we then have free will. Yeah? We can do things out of will. We can move about. These kind of things that are associated with animals is called the animal soul. And then beyond that was the human rational soul. And again, as we spoke about in the last couple of lectures, it is the intellect that is at the height of that, that potential that you get through going through all of these stages. But the important way of looking at the soul, not as a complete entity that simply attaches to the body, but rather looking at the soul as something that goes through some kind of meaningful development, has huge implications. The soul is at different stages of development. And of course, therefore, what that means is that interventions and education has to be sensitive to all of these stages, and also what has preceded in the previous stage. This is something very key for us as we come to thinking about how to deal with different situations in mental health. As I put in the next point, trauma at each stage affects the soul and its growth differently, because it's affecting a different reality. Something that happens in adulthood is different to something that happens in childhood, because the soul is fundamentally different. As well as how it manifests in behavior as well, because the soul is responsible for our behavior and actions. So however it affects at a young age will have a certain type of manifestation in behavior, and if it occurs in an older age, perhaps a different kind of behavior. So as we see when we look at the events of Karbala, again, when we look at the different people who are there, they are all at different ages. They are all at different stages. They all have different background stories. They are all affected in different ways. This is a key for us to start to think beyond what we just read sometimes in the historical accounts, and to really look behind what is going on in people's minds as they attend these events. Of course, the higher level of engagement we have with these texts, the more we understand what is happening, or can kind of opine what the feelings, what the interactions, what's going on in the minds of all of those that are present there, the more we can connect to these events, the more we can gain that understanding that will then form the foundation upon which we can have that emotional connection as well. When we look at the members of the family of the Ahlul Bayt and the way they stood on that day, we even see young children standing and having a firm grasp of the truth. And that is to do with the upbringing that was in these households, the kind of progression that they went through, and the kind of interventions that were given to them as they're growing up to create these kind of personalities. Of course, this is something key to draw from, because we in every time are concerned with the development of our next generations, the development of ourselves, of course, but we're also concerned about the development of the next generations. To think about all of these things are important for us in the current time, but as well another way for us to open up and to understand the events which occurred in Ashura. Final couple of slides. When we talked about the practical intellect, we said that the last stage of the practical intellect is annihilation of the ego and the self. And of course, this corresponds to the ultimate sacrifice of the body as well, because here you can see a connection between the annihilation of the body and also the annihilation of the ego. Those people who fought on the day of Ashura, they didn't fight for themselves. It was not to do with their ego, it was not to do with themselves. They fought and sacrificed themselves for the sake of Imam al-Hussein alayhi afdalus salatu wassalam. So we can see a link here. Annihilation, of course, is a technical term. It goes into a very high spiritual state where the ego itself is completely destroyed from the being of a person. The next thing is to know or to recognize what to follow to attain felicity. Similarly, as in this world, it's important to understand what advice to take and what advice to ignore. Sometimes, for example, if you want to purchase something new, one of the first things we do is go to reviews. Yeah, we go to reviews to see whether that product is worth it, whether the advert is the same as the practical experience of the people who are using that product. For us to recognize who we have to follow or what advice we should really take on board seriously is part of our practical intellect. That is part of us really identifying with our infallibles and seeing them in that position. So this is manifested clearly on the day of Ashura. There is a group of people who have recognized and a group of people who have not. The whole journey to Karbala and the military strategies of the Imam, I mentioned some of this last year when we were talking about the intellectual choices of the Imam as he moved through the various stages, from moving out of Medina, from deciding to leave Makkah, his decision to move towards Kufa. All of these showed a practical intellect, an intellect that was aware of circumstances and an intellect that was able to choose the correct path. And finally, practicing law through the recitation of the prayer of fear on the day of Ashura. So if you remember, the first stage of the practical intellect was practicing religion. On the day of Ashura, the camp of Imam al-Hussein prayed even in the heat of that battle, and they prayed the prayer of fear. Finally, just some points for the theoretical intellect. As we can see there, certainty, which is found on the theoretical level, that knowledge that is useful, that certainty in the path of felicity enabled people to follow the Imam on that day and to not leave him. The next is in terms of witnessing their stations on the night of Ashura. That is to do with what we said in the fourth stage of the intellect, of the theoretical intellect, when we said access to the divine kingdom. This is a kind of access to that which is beyond. The Imam opened up for them and showed them their stations in heaven. And the last one here, God is worshipped and heaven is attained. And again, when it comes to the events of Ashura, we see the spiritual intellect in full force with all of the companions of the holy Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and his family members as well. So inshallah, these are some applications. I hope you've all enjoyed the series as much as I have enjoyed delivering it. And inshallah, I hope it is a starting point for many further discussions and further thought in these areas. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
Thank you very much for your talk. We now have some time for some question and answers. Are there any questions on either side?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I had a question about the kind of progress and the development of the soul over your lifespan, because you said that you can there's two clear paths to follow, either towards perdition or felicity. But I feel maybe my experience, maybe the experience of many people, is that you go through fluctuations. There are times in your life when you feel more spiritual, sometimes when you completely fall off, and that doesn't seem to follow that progression. You know, you're up and down. So how does that fit in?
Thank you. There are two clear paths, but that doesn't mean that the movement on that path is linear. That being said as well, there is a huge difference between perdition and salvation. When we go through ups and downs, that doesn't mean we're on the path of perdition. The path of perdition is in a macro sense, that the cumulative decisions that you make weigh more towards perdition than they do to success. You keep moving down that same path, and as you move down that same path, it's almost like a snowball. And of course, that doesn't mean there's once you start down one path, that's the end. You can also switch paths. That's the whole point of forgiveness. Yeah, and also what we have many times about people who reach very high stations and then fall. Yeah, so we have this crossover between them, and also, like you say, it's not linear. It's not like every day, but the cumulative path that you're on is of one of these two.
So then, once the soul reaches a particular stage of development, it can go back in development as well, or is...
Well, as in, when you talk about going back, it's not going back, it's going forward in a different direction. So when, let's say for example, a person has lived a life of difficulty, sin, so on and so forth, but then they reach a point of forgiveness. That doesn't reverse their journey until now, but it begins a new foot on a new trajectory. Yeah? So this is how I see it. It's not a backwards movement at all. It's a continual forwards movement.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykhuna. Thank you very much for the talk. So my question is in relation to the enemies. When you're referring to them about the soul, theirs is going towards, the negative rather than the positive. So with Sayyid Fatimi's lecture series before yours, he put forward a narrative that in fact the enemy were pious believers. They were, in fact, they did what they did taqarruban ilallahi ta'ala. So in their mind and their understanding, maybe not the leaders, but in the simpletons, in their understanding, they are pious. And therefore they are doing something good. Their intention is taqarrub. Their action is negative, their intention is positive. Similar to suicide bombers or anyone who comes and, bombs Shia centers or something. So what is, because you're obviously saying they're how does the two reconcile?
Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent question, and it also betrays different ways of looking at the same events too. There are instances, for example, that you see within the scriptural sources or the historical sources where, for example, you'll see that the army of the enemy prayed. Or you'll see, for example, other things like that. And perhaps from that you may derive that they were pious. But that is a step. There is a difference between someone praying outwardly and them being pious. Hypocrites also pray outwardly. So for me, when I look at the enemies that were actually involved in the battle, because this is also an important distinction, about 30,000 people attended the event of Karbala from the side of Umar ibn Sa'd. But most of these people didn't fight. The reason why they didn't fight is because pragmatically it would not be possible. You have a band of about 100 people, okay? Now, if you have a fight one-on-one, okay, that's one thing. If it's two-on-one, you need to have some level of coordination between both of them. Otherwise, one might end up hurting the other. And as you move across the multiples, it becomes even more complex in order to deal with one person, right? So, most of the people in this army did not fight. I mean, if you want to put a multiple of 10, you're looking at about 1,000 people. If you're looking at a multiple of 20, 2,000, fine. But until you reach a multiple of like 15, no, wait, more than that. Until you reach a very high multiple, you're not going to include the whole, the whole army or even half of the army. Okay? So those people who were innocent, who were dragged onto the battlefield, we even have some historians saying that one of the reasons why Imam Hussein went to the Euphrates was not out of thirst. In his final stand, he went towards the Euphrates with Hazrat Abbas. Some historians said this is out of thirst, but others have said no. There were some Kufans, the innocent ones, who wanted to join the battle on the side of Imam Hussein. So it's a continuing stand, but they were being prevented. So Imam Hussein was trying to break through this in order to get more supporters, right? So for sure there were people on that day that were not happy with what was going on. They were forced to be there. It was the policies of Ibn Ziyad that made them go there in the first place, right? But at the same time, so they were there and they were forced to be there. But at the same time, there was a group. There was a group that was bent on killing Imam Hussein in the most horrific manner. And it's these people that I'm referring to when I'm talking about this. And I think when Sayyid Fatimi is talking about both of these aspects, it's important to differentiate those who were actually involved in the fighting and those people that were present. For sure, among the 30,000, there must have been some pious people, some people who were, not happy with why they were there. When it comes to Hur, we very much praise Hur because of his change of heart. Okay? But the difference between Hur and many other people within the army was Hur's position. Hur was able to mount a horse. Hur was able to escape. Not everybody was able to do it. Not everyone had a horse, right? They would have been prevented from doing what Hur was able to do. So does that get to? Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the women's side?
Alaikum salam.
Thank you. Hello. Assalamu alaikum. I was just thinking about your first lecture about how the practice of religious law affects our soul, and that links to our mental health and ethical nature, right? So the Imams, they've instructed us to annually commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein and to read, mourn, recite poetry, and this is obviously an act of ibadah, this legislation of Allah. So how does that? This is obviously a very emotional act of ibadah compared to all our other acts of ibadah. So I just want to know if there's any thoughts about how does that relate to us in a soul sense, anything like that. Yeah, just any thoughts.
Absolutely. Our ability to emotionally connect and empathize with the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam has a huge effect on sometimes on our life direction. Right? Some people can be so influenced by the emotional connection that they build in the time of Muharram that it affects many other parts of their lives as well. And the thing is this, sometimes we have different ways of connecting. Connecting intellectually is one way and an important way. Connecting emotionally is another important way. And if we really think about it, we do connect emotionally. We connect emotionally with Allah. We love Allah. We connect emotionally with the Prophet. We love, respect, and want to be like our Prophet. And the same way as well, events like these where we are encouraged to commemorate and increase that emotional connection because it also affects the other emotional connections as well. You can't love Imam Hussein without loving Allah. That's not Imam Hussein you love then. That's someone else. Yeah. So for sure, there's an effect on the soul from the commemoration of events.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think we'll end there. Can we have a salawat?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Tonight, as we close one book of tragedy, we open another of prolonged suffering and humiliation. The unprotected women and children of the house of Abu Talib were subjected to the most evil of people. While what occurred after the battle in terms of looting was something normalized at that time, the tragedy of these events is the sheer lack of appreciation of the sanctity of the Prophet's household, and how this all occurred at the hands of people who were absorbed with the dunya, to such an extent that Imam al-Hussein, or rather the Prophet himself, meant nothing to them. After the army of Umar ibn Sa'd had beheaded, trampled and looted Imam al-Hussein, they proceeded to loot the tents. At-Tabari, quoting Abu Mikhnaf from Imam al-Sadiq, says, "The enemy began to loot the personal possessions, garments and camels of the Imam. Then they directed themselves towards the women folk of al-Hussein and to the provisions that he had brought on his journey. There was no woman spared until they had successfully snatched the robe from her back, forcibly depriving her of it, and carried it away. The tents were burnt, leaving the family without shelter that night. In Al-Malhuf it says, then they drove the women out of the tents and set the tents on fire. The women ran out, uncovered, plundered, barefoot, and in tears, resembling abject prisoners. The enemies rejoiced over their win and congratulated each other as the news was sent to Yazid and the other governors in the Muslim world. The head of Imam al-Hussein was immediately sent to Ibn Ziyad, followed by the heads of the rest of the martyrs. For the first time in the history of the Muslim world, the heads were mounted on spears. Abu Mikhnaf relates, in Kufa, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad had the head of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam mounted and paraded around Kufa. The heads were then dispatched to Yazid, and until now the final resting place of the head of Imam al-Hussein is uncertain. Umar ibn Sa'ad remained in Karbala that day and the next day, and then gave the order for his men to depart. They headed towards Kufa, taking with them the daughters and sisters of al-Hussein and the other women and children who were with them. Ali ibn Hussein was also amongst the captives, and he was ill. In Tariq al-Tabari, there is a quote from Qurra ibn Qais al-Tamimi. He said, I was watching those women when they were taken past the slain body of al-Hussein, his family members, and his son. They wailed and scratched their faces. Whatever else I might forget, I will never forget the lament of Zainab, the daughter of Fatima, when she passed by her brother al-Hussein, whose body lay on the ground. O Muhammad, may the angels in the sky send blessings on you. Here lies al-Hussein in the wilderness, covered in blood, with his limbs severed. O Muhammad, and your daughters are captives, your children lie slain, and the desert breeze blows dust over them. فما نسيت من الأشياء لا أنسى قول زينب ابنتي فاطمة حين مرت بأخيها الحسين عليه السلام صريعا وهي تقول يا محمدا يا محمدا صلي عليك ملائكة السماء هذا حسين بالعراء مرمل بالدماء مقطع الأعضاء يا محمدا وبناتك سبايا وذريتك مقتلة تسفي عليها الصبا ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين صلاة على محمد.
Salaat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let us begin by offering our humble condolences to that grief-stricken mother, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, in whose spiritual garden we gather tonight. The poetry that will be recited are the questions and feelings of Imam Hussein's daughter after losing her beloved father. Salawat. The night is drawing, the candles are lit. Sakina is looking for her father. Where are you, Father? I'm looking for you. Look at my ears, they're bleeding now. They've torn my ears, they've taken my earrings, they've slapped my face, they've pushed me around. Is that what you call an orphan father? Where are you, Father? I'm looking for you. I'm hungry now, I'm thirsty too. I'm tired, I want to sleep, Father. There's no home, there's nowhere to sleep. I want to sleep in your arms, Father. Where are you, Father? I'm looking for you. The night is drawing, the candles are lit. Sakina is looking for her father. Where are you, Father? I'm looking for you. They've brought some water I cannot drink. Asker's younger, he's more thirsty. His cradle's empty, it's burning now. Can you see the smoke, Father? Where are you, Father? I'm looking for you. I do not want to leave Karbala. I'll stay here with you, Father. I cannot bear the parting from you. I'll stay here, I don't want to go. Where are you, Father? Where are you, Father? I'm looking for you. Salaat.
Just a few announcements before Salah. Please donate towards the Muharram funds. We can only continue our programs with the generosity of our community. The approximate cost for our Muharram program is £7,500. So if you can, please contribute towards. There are iPads on either side for card donations, or you can donate online at sikkim.org.uk/give. Thank you for joining us for our Muharram program. Please do join us for our regular programs outside of Muharram also. We have a lot going on, such as weekly Friday lectures, monthly children's classes and games, women's exercise classes, women's yoga. Check out our website for more information. And if you would like to join the Method WhatsApp events group, please ask one of the executive committee members and they can add you. Thank you. Salawat.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله وصل اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين